morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome to our panel today on the NLG, the No Lost Generation. Before we start, though, I have some tragic news. One of our panelists, the CEO of INJAZ, Dina, is unable to join us, and it's because of the death of the regional director of INJAZ, Salama, Ms. Syria Crisis, and her sister, Dina. Many of you will know Syria, who has been a tremendous advocate for young people and for their education for many years. For UNICEF and all the partners working on Syria and the related response, we have lost an advocate for children, an advocate for youth, an advocate and ally for education. I'll ask you all to stand and just observe 1 minute silence, remembering Syria and her sister. Thank you. Colleagues, on that poignant note, I think we should all be inspired by the life of Syria Crisis as we come at this critical time for an important session that really takes the heart of what resilience and this development forum, I believe, is trying to achieve. As the Syria Crisis enters its 5th year, as next year we celebrate the World Humanitarian Summit, the onset of the Sustainable Development Goals, for me there's nothing more important than the topic we'll be discussing today, the education, protection and engagement of the young people in the Middle East and North Africa. In 2013, a group of UN, NGO, government and civil society partners came together to focus on a key neglected set of issues. The fact is, in traditional humanitarian response, we very rarely highlight the needs of education, of protection, and of youth engagement. So those partners in 2013 created a new idea, a new initiative called the No Lost Generation, or NLG initiative. The aim was to put a focus, to shine a light on education and protection, and to develop an innovative partnership to work on this set of issues. And the results are very clear. Not only the enormous amount of support that these areas have received from the international community, including and especially the host governments of surrounding countries receiving refugees from Syria, and of course the Syrian government itself, but in very concrete terms. More than 1.5 million children and young people have been supported to go to school. More than 500,000 children and young people have received psychosocial interventions and support. And more than 300,000 young people have been engaged in more than 800 development initiatives across the region. However, we're seeing more and more dramas in the region, more and more dramatic events. Of course, the world has been focused now on not only the large number of Syrians who are going into the surrounding countries, particularly of Turkey, of Lebanon, of Jordan, of Iraq, and of Egypt, now numbering more than 4 million. But also, of course, the young people and the Syrian refugees going towards Europe. Eurostat now estimates that more than half, around 55%, of all Syrian refugees entering Europe are in the age group 18 to 34 years. So they're predominantly young people. Europe was also very focused on the issue of radicalization of young people in the Middle East and elsewhere. So as we take this context into account and refocus on the need to prevent a lost generation of young people, the challenges we face collectively are stark. There still remain 2.7 million children out of school. We still have what is in effect the worst protection crisis anywhere in the world today. Children are being recruited into the armed forces, formal and informal, across the region. We see the patterns of that recruitment changing. Younger children, more and more in combat roles, more and more forced abduction. We also know that beneath these headlines are some less dramatic changes in the social fabric in the Middle East and North Africa. The fault lines are widening. And we see that in negative coping mechanisms, whether it's the increase in child labor, whether it's the increase in early marriage amongst both refugee populations in the region, but also in Syria itself. And most importantly, perhaps, but harder to measure, we see it in the hopelessness and despair of young people across the region, further driving their existing desires to move. So our aim today, colleagues, is to discuss some of the key lessons learned from the initial NLG Phase 1. Secondarily, where we need to go next, programmatically and in advocacy terms. And finally, to make specific, concrete recommendations to the organisers of this important Resilience Development Forum. We've got a great panel here in order to help us talk through and think through these issues and come to some specific recommendations. Let me introduce them just by title, and I'm sure they'll tell you a bit more about their experience and themselves during their intervention. Our first speaker will be Dr. Khawla Abu Haija. She's from the Ministry of Education in Jordan, a key director there. We have Dina Craissati, who's our Regional Education Advisor at UNICEF. We have Jane McPhail, and I correct, apologies Jane to your name tag, it's McPhail, who's Director of NLG at Mercy Corps, one of the key partners involved from the NGO community, and we have several others in the room, I believe, including from World Vision. We have as well Mr. Fehmi Karami, who's the Senior Advisor to the Ministry of Social Affairs, Women, Children's Rights and Protection from the Government of Lebanon. We have Craissati, who's the Thematic Advisor for Child Protection for the Middle East from Save the Children Fund in Sweden. And we have Sukru Chanskulu, who's the Regional Protection Coordinator at UNHCR. And I'm sorry for pronouncing your name incorrectly, I'm sure I did, Sukru. And we'll also have an intervention from the floor from our UNRWA colleague after the panel. So without further ado, I'll ask Dr. Khawla to make her remarks. Each of the panelists have around 5 to 10 minutes to make their remarks. So Dr. Khawla, please, we'll start with you. Dr. Khawla will speak in Arabic, so you'll have the English translation. If you haven't got a microphone, they should be available at the side of the room on channel 1.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صباح الخير. سأحاول على عجالة أن أنقل لكم ما أريد بشكل إن شاء الله واضح ومفهوم للجميع. ال10 دقائق ربما لا تكفي، ولكن سأحاول أن ألخص. الحكومة الأردنية تتيح فرصة التعليم للجميع، حيث تكفل الدستور الأردني من خلال التشريعات والقوانين والتعليمات والاتفاقيات الدولية التي قامت بها الحكومة الأردنية بالتوقيع عليها حق التعليم للجميع بصرف النظر عن العرق والجنس والدين، وفي جميع المراحل والمستويات، كما ساوى بين الأردنيين وغير الأردنيين من حيث القبول في المدارس الحكومية والخاصة ومن حيث التعاون. العملية التربوية كما تعرفون هي ركيزة أساسية من ركائز تقدم الدول وتطورها، وهي تنطلق من سياسة الدولة وأهدافها للسير قدما في ركب الدول المتقدمة وتحقيق طموحات شعوبها في الرفاه والازدهار، لتخطو خطوات واثقة في مسيرة العمل والبناء وتحقيق مزيد من الإنجازات على الصعود الأكبر. تتقاسم أدوار العملية التربوية بأبعادها كافة أطراف عدة، منها الأسرة، المجتمع المحلي، الأفراد، المؤسسات العامة والخاصة المحلية منها والدولية، بحيث تتعاون تلك الأطراف وتتكاتف جهودها للنهوض بجزء من المسؤولية، إذ يأتي دورها مكملا لدور الدولة في النهوض بالتعليم والارتقاء بمخرجاته. ما تم الإجراءات المتبعة لقبول الطلبة اللاجئين. بالرغم من كل التحديات فقد أخذت الوزارة على عاتقها تنفيذ التوجيهات الملكية السامية والالتزام بالمواثيق والمعاهدات الدولية فيما يتعلق بحق اللاجئين في الحصول على التعليم، وقامت بتهيئة التعليمات والأسس وتسيير الإجراءات من أجل حصول اللاجئين على تعلم نوعي ومميز لأطفالهم، رغم عدم كفاية الدعم المقدم على على قطاع التعليم من قبل المؤسسات والهيئات الدولية. وقد أخذت الحكومة الأردنية على عاتقها الحمل الأكبر خاصة في قطاع التعليم لاستيعاب أكبر عدد ممكن من الطلبة اللاجئين في مدارس المملكة الأردنية الهاشمية نتيجة للأحداث التي تمر بها دول الجوار وخاصة الأزمة السورية، واتخذت عدد من الإجراءات لاستيعابهم وتوفير فرص التعليم لهم، منها تسهيل قبول الطلبة السوريين في المدارس الحكومية والخاصة بدون أوراق مدرسية مصدقة أو حصول ولي أمرهم على تصريح عمل، وكان الشرط فقط حصولهم على وثيقة لجوء مع إعفاء الطلبة السوريين في المدارس الحكومية من دفع أثمان كتب وتبرعات مدرسية، وتم استيعابهم بالمدارس الخاصة والحكومية. ولكن نتيجة تزايد الأعداد الطلبة السوريين في كافة أنحاء المملكة وخاصة في الشمال والوسط تم إجراء التالي. وكانت البداية بأنه تم استيعاب الطلبة في بداية الأزمة، تم استيعاب الطلبة في المدارس الحكومية بشكل عام، ولكن عند تزايد الأزمة تم افتتاح 28 مدرسة داخل مخيم الزعتري، افتتاح 8 مدارس داخل مخيم رجيب الفود والمخيزن ضمن مديرية الزرقاء الثانية وهي منطقة في الوسط. تم استهداف أيضا نتيجة الأزمة وعدم استيعاب مدارسنا للعدد الكم الهائل من الطلبة السوريين، تم استحداث 28 فترة مسائية مخصصة للطلبة في محافظات الشمال والوسط. تم شمول الطلبة السوري ببرامج الدعم النفسي الاجتماعي وبرامج المساعدة الأخرى، شمول جميع الطلبة السوريين بالخدمات الصحية والتغذية المدرسية التي تقدمها الوزارة للطلبة الأردنيين، تقديم العديد من برامج التقوية والتعمق للطلبة السوريين وحسب أماكن تواجدهم بالتعاون مع عدد من المنظمات الدولية نتيجة التحاقهم بالتعليم متأخر. الآثار المترتبة على قطاع التعليم نتيجة هذه الاستضافة وهي أولا إنه الإبقاء على نظام الفترتين، وهذا كانت تسعى الوزارة قبلا من الاستغناء عن نظام الفترتين، فزاد عدد المدارس التي تعمل بنظام الفترتين. تزايد الكثافة الطلابية في الصفوف وابتضاعها وارتفاع معدل طالب معلم في الغرفة الصفية. تم التقليل من حصة الطالب في النفقات الاستهلاكية في المدرسة. تكليف الصيانة للأبنية والمرافق العامة مما يؤدي إلى زيادة التكلفة على الوزارة. الضغط على المختبرات الحاسوب والعلمية والمختبرات الحاسوبية والمجال والدورات الصحية والساحات، حيث أن تضاعف أعداد الطلبة. تسعى الحكومة الأردنية نتيجة لوجود أعداد كبير من الطلبة السوريين خارج النظام التعليمي ما تنطبق عليهم خصوص الالتحاق بالتعليم النظامي، والذي يقدر ب90,000 طالب حسب إحصائيات اليونيسف، وبسبب الاكتظاظ في مدارس لا يوجد قدرة استيعابية لهؤلاء الطلبة، مما نتج أعداد كبيرة من الطلبة خارج مقاعد الدراسة أو التعليم الرسمي كما نقول له، الذي يعتبر هو الأساس في التعليم في المملكة الأردنية الهاشمية. وهناك أعداد لا تنطبق عليهم تعليمات الالتحاق بالقبول، تم إلحاقهم بالتعليم غير النظامي، وهو أيضا جزء تلجأ إليه وزارة التربية والتعليم في حالات نادرة ومتعذرة، ولكن الآن قمنا بالتوسع في التعليم غير النظامي، أي الطلبة الذين تزيد أعمارهم عن 12 سنة. لحل مشكلة الوزارة تحتاج وزارة التربية والتعليم إلى بناء العديد من المدارس في مناطق مختلفة من المملكة بحيث يتم استيعابهم فيها وإضافة عدد من الشعب الصفية لعدد من المدارس القائمة حاليا والتي تعاني أصلا من الاكتظاظ، علما بأن هناك توجه لعدد من المنظمات الدولية لاستيعاب هؤلاء الطلبة فيما يسمى بالتعليم غير الرسمي، وذلك من أجل حصولهم على مهارات القراءة والحساب فقط. وهذا النظام غير معترف به رسميا في وزارة التربية والتعليم، ولا يمكن اعتماده بديلا للتعليم النظامي أو غير النظامي لعدم إمكانية إعطائهم شهادات رسمية معترف بها. ولذلك لا بد من النظر إلى المشكلة وحلها بشكل جذري، والشكل الجذري هو أما إضافات صفية أو بناء مدارس. وفي حالة تعذر ذلك في الوقت الحاضر نلجأ إلى التعليم الغير رسمي، ولكنه لن يحل المشكلة، وبالتالي لا بد من وضعية بحيث أنه ما الذي سيفعله الطلبة الذين يلتحقون بالتعليم غير الرسمي. وبذلك يجب أن ننظر إلى هذا الموضوع بجدية كاملة، وأن الحل بالنسبة لوزارة التربية والتعليم بالنسبة للحكومة الأردنية هي زيادة عدد الأبنية المدرسية اللي موجودة، وبذلك سيلتحق جميع الطلبة الموجودين في المدارس ويتلقون تعليما رسميا كباقي الطلبة الموجودين. شكرا جزيلا، وآسف على الإطالة إن كنت أطلت. شكرا.
Thanks, Dr. Khawla. We'll go straight to Dina for the next presentation. You'll note that the first two presentations on education. The next one is the second pillar of the theme of the NLG, which is on youth. And the last two presentations will be on protection. So we're covering in order the key three pillars of the No Lost Generation initiative. So the second presentation on education. Thanks, Dina.
Thank you very much. I will be building on Dr. Khawla's example of Jordan and give you a general idea on the status of education in the Syria Crisis sub-region, together with challenges, and then note some of the shifts that need to happen to ensure schooling, to ensure sustainable access to quality certified education for Syrian children and youth. First, with regard to general picture on access to education in Syria, basically around half of the Syrian school-age children inside Syria together with outside Syria are out of school. If you see inside Syria, the first number is 2.1 million out-of-school children, representing 40% of the school-age population, and outside Syria we have 1 in 2 Syrian children who are out of school, with the majority in Turkey because of the influx, and Lebanon, lesser percentages in Jordan because the influx of the Syrian refugee has been stabilizing. In Iraq, low numbers but high percentages because of the crises last year. And Egypt, low percentages because almost all Syrian children have been absorbed by the public sector. Now, how does this look in terms of evolution? If you compare the two columns in this graph, the yellow and blue one for inside Syria with the orange and green one, you see that the number of out-of-school children inside and outside Syria is in relation to each other. So if you have a sort of stabilization inside Syria, it's because the children go out of Syria. And if you have an increase in the number of out-of-school children outside Syria, it's because of the influx. So inside Syria, the numbers have been growing together with the percentages because of the intensification of the crisis. And outside, the numbers have been growing, but the percentages have been less, mostly due to efforts of governments. These pictures show you the situation, the evolution of the situation inside Syria as I described. And one thing that should be noted inside Syria is the geopolitical complexity of access. So this figure shows you the distribution of school-age children inside Syria. With half of these children in the gray shaded area, these are the government controlled areas. The other half are in around 1 million in ISIL controlled areas, and the rest in opposition controlled and that are blue, and the Kurdish areas that are green. This basically to say, to note the challenges that the operations of education provision face. And this also, in terms of the numbers of out-of-school children in the host country, shows you the instability of access. There was a peak early this year in the numbers of out-of-school because the intensity of the crisis and the influx of refugees, and then it goes down. Now, generally the picture is that the numbers and percentages of Syrian out-of-school children are slowly increasing. However, there has been some kind of the increase has not been dramatic because of the response of the governments and the partners within the framework of the Lost Generation. What has been done? There has been major three basis axes of works in terms of system strengthening, access and quality. Governments have done major efforts in leading on the response and in owning the response. Big efforts in terms of coordination, embedding into sector plans, creating the evidence-based, as Dr. Khawla noted, construction and rehabilitation, back-to-learning campaigns, teacher training, and a lot has been done also on remedial education to help Syrian children catch up. However, there have been major challenges. Systems are overburdened and overstretched. The non-formal provisions only reaches 10% of school-age children. Also, in terms of access, there is a major challenge in terms of the learning spaces. And in terms of quality, I don't remember by heart, otherwise I would have continued to. It's fine, I'm trying to remember. Okay. As noted, access is strained because of the continued movement of children, the limited learning spaces, and also attacks and occupation of schools. And the learning has been limited because there are language and curriculum challenges. As you know, refugee children do face multiple curricula, often not in their own language and at different levels. There are difficulties also in dealing with trauma and stress, and non-formal education, which is also essential, has been suffering from low quality and lack of structure. Now, what do we need to do in order to improve and scale access to quality and certified learning? There are two shifts that are needed within the framework of the NLG. One is that, yes, the immediate crisis needs need to be scaled up. However, there needs to be also a shift to longer-term approaches and strategies that represent investment for a better future. And second, there needs to develop models of schooling that are based on inclusion and social cohesion, that recognize that Syrian children need to get an education that safeguards a safe sense of identity as well as hope for return. So how do we propose to do this together with partners? First of all, and through the NLG framework, first of all, the need to sustain a national education system. The education response now needs more and more to be embedded in strategies that also address the needs and rights of host community children. What is also important is the strengthening of institutions at the decentralized level, because this is here that you get the needs and you can operate directly with children. Second, what is more important is that we know multiple pathways are needed for the provision of education. However, they need regulated, coordinated frameworks with the private sector, the public sector, and NGOs. And the issue of certification needs to be addressed. So we have undertaken a study in UNICEF on the status of accreditation and certification, and the study. You have copies here and you can visit our booth, but it shows that one of the major challenges now facing access to education is the issue of certification. Parents want their children to go to school, yes, but they want them to have a certificate. In terms of scaling access inside Syria, there is now within the whole of Syria approach heightened effort to expand and consolidate operations cross-line and cross-border. Also, the maximization of learning spaces need to be addressed together with rationalization, and we need to find the mobile solution now, online solution, creative solutions for access. And one key issue in terms of the shift is that we need to have a more focused attention now on the post-basic age group through the expansion of upper secondary TVET opportunity and employability skills. And finally, and not the least, is the need now to invest more systematically in learning. Children do have access to education, but they need structured education. And they need also an education that's not only based on the transfer of knowledge, but also based on life skills and on citizenship education that is based on human rights. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dina. We're going to move straight to our next thematic area, which is on young people, and Jane McPhail from Mexico. The floor is yours.
So we know these things are true. We know that young people are paying the highest price, particularly in this environment. This assessment was actually part of NLG1's first launch into Syria to see what was happening, what the young people were saying they needed, and also for us to try and make a link between agencies, because we truly wanted to continue our work inside Syria, and we needed to be creative in how we did it. The areas that we prioritised were, of course, the needs and gaps and the coping mechanisms. How adolescents had their own view on what they were looking at in the context of their communities and their families, and most especially for the future. Then we looked at the roles of how families and the communities looked at young people. And then we looked at who they turned to for support. If you have a look at this, we did 120 focus group discussions, 60 males, 60 females in total. Nearly 500 people we spoke to. And this was over quite a long period of time. And we were incredibly cautious how we did it. But the particular areas that we wanted to also focus on outside of what I've already talked about is what do kids think about safety and security, the educational needs, employment and livelihood, health, participation in their roles in the community, how are they seen, what do they think, and what do they think other people see of them, and of course the DVB concerns. This was actually taken from a young man in 2014. Quite interesting, even at that stage he was thinking about hopping on a boat and going to Sweden. I looked at that and I thought, I wonder if it's got there. He said he was tired of dreaming about food and whether or not he would get food that day. So we walked into opposition-controlled areas and besieged areas and areas, of course, that were safer and had better services. In areas of Homs and Salama, what we did was we actually looked at what the specific area issues were for young people. So in Homs, of course, there was a great struggle for young people not to join the combatant forces. And work on social cohesion for that at that time was very dangerous. And many youth engaged in civic media and humanitarian work. And drug use at that time had actually increased. And actually, a lot of the young people at that time were talking to us about how the armed forces were actually supplying the drugs in the community, and that it was actually very much a way for them. They knew what was happening. They knew that it was very much a way for them to become numb. So in other areas around central Syria and Salama, lack of employment, lack of access to rights, political diversity leading to family problems, and displaced persons are harassed. And they were talking about people from other areas inside Syria who would actually come into Homs, and how there was quite a lot of social unrest between the visitors and the host community. In other areas, we looked at, they talked about high illiteracy rate in the governance, and they talked about youth engaging and leading efforts to support the city. They were very, very proactive in this particular area about how they saw themselves. They were very, very strong in how they saw themselves in this community. In Dara, large percentage of young men were wanted by the regime. Many of them lived in areas and they fled into isolated areas, and actually they were not just disenfranchised from the need to flee, but also from their own families because of the situation of if you don't go and join an armed force, then your family is in trouble too. So they distanced themselves from their families. Young women were a majority in government-held areas. They were the strongest force that we spoke to because a lot of the young men had gone off to fight. Youth were, of course, involved in armed groups, as well as civic media, first aid, and humanitarian work. They saw that this was a very positive perspective for them. There was a small percentage of youth trying to continue their university education, and of course there was an increase in drugs and alcohol. In Sweden, they talked very positively about their active engagement in work in the community. They considered themselves to be a highly educated group of young people. They were worried about increased marriage of youth around the 18 to 25, and how this actually was happening absolutely because of poverty, but it actually drew a separation line that was much more impactful for them. In rural Damascus, young people talked about gaining new skills and experiences. They particularly had it in their head that they were looking at the context of civic and community work and being able to expand this into some humanitarian context. They talked a lot about lack of other employment options. because a lot of the young people that we talked to at that particular stage were in actual fact in those that were in child labour, that paid incredibly poor amounts. $100 a month was the average wage for a young person of 18, and the labour that they were expected to do was far beyond their physical capability. As you can see, there are lots and lots of issues here. We talked with a lot of young people who, talked about the general things of life, how it was difficult to live, how they wanted food, how they wanted consistent water. They knew that they weren't getting electricity. But they also wanted to take on a much larger role and responsibility in their communities. They talked about the lack of importance of youth in society and how there wasn't enough attention to their needs. Young people felt like their particular energy was, we heard this constantly. They thought that they were underutilised. They thought they did not have a voice. And you'll see. So some of the key findings that we looked at were, of course, parents said very clearly that up to 96% of parents that we interviewed said education was one of the key elements. The young people, not quite so high, but for them, some of the biggest conversations that were happening was that if they couldn't go to school, they didn't want to lose the ability to use their brain. So they already had in their head, how do I not stop myself from not keeping myself from relearning even if I can't get to school? You talked a lot about security. They talked a lot about security. As you can see, it was the second highest element. Of course, health, food, work, shelter, emotional stability. And when we got talking with young people, these were the elements in this order that they said they go to in order to survive the craziness of their life. They talked about illegal actions, depression, rebellion, dropout, armed groups and drugs. Isn't it interesting how armed groups is higher than drugs and alcohol? I thought that was fascinating. So, support, these were taken as, when we did the analysis in this particular assessment, these were the general findings. Support female adolescents in getting involved with their communities, outside the family circle, and reconnecting with their friends through small-scale community projects to reduce isolation and hopelessness. Identify possibilities and support the inclusion of male adolescents in relief and community support projects to foster a sense of agency and purpose, of course while enhancing their other skills. Raise awareness amongst parents and community at large of the adolescent needs. This has actually been one of the very biggest hurdles that we have undertaken inside our Syria projects, where we are constantly talking with parents and doing parent awareness sessions so that they can actually have an understanding about what happens with young people. So in the report you will see that up to 70% of family members were actually saying that the young people were more of a drain than what they were unless they offered a practical value to the family, like bringing up the small children or collecting the water or going to get humanitarian aid. So the concept for families was quite difficult. Access to education, including informal, solutions to finishing university, development of training, vocational trainings, employment opportunities that add a value context to the family and to a sense of self-worth. Social media access to the global community so they can learn. Activities in adolescent centres need to be available at a reasonable distance, and above all, parents' approval must be gained. The young people who actually took part in this were very determined to have a voice, and even when buildings were being blown up, they were coming back in order to make sure that someone could hear them. Thanks for listening.
so much, Jane. Fascinating study and really important that we take into account very strongly in the next phase of NLG the articulated views and aspirations of young people in the region. We're going to move finally to the area of protection. I'm going to start with Mr. Fehmi Karami, the Senior Advisor to the Minister of Social Affairs in the Government of Lebanon.
Thank you. صباح الخير جميعا. سأبدأ ببعض الأرقام السريعة. 10,452 كيلومتر مربع مساحة لبنان. 4 ملايين نسمة عدد سكاني. 1,500,000 لاجئ على الأراضي اللبنانية. حوالي 600,000 طفل. حوالي 300,000 امرأة دخلوا وأصبحوا مقيمين على الأراضي اللبنانية ودخلوا في نسيج المجتمع اللبناني، حيث لا توجد في لبنان مخيمات رسمية، إنما هناك مجموعة من المخيمات العشوائية. ما هو واقع الدولة أمام هذا الازدياد المفاجئ الغير طبيعي الغير مرتقب؟ مزيد من الفقراء يعني مزيد من انتهاك للحقوق، ولا سيما مزيد من الاستغلال للأطفال والنساء بشكل خاص. إرهاق للبنية التحتية للدولة وللخدمات التي تقدمها، والتي هي أصلاً أي في لبنان تعاني ما تعانيه من الأزمات الاقتصادية والسياسية. وبالطبع إرهاق للنظام القضائي والنظام الحماية والنظام الاجتماعي، وخاصة أيضا المؤسسات الرعائية التي لم تعد تستطيع أن تستقبل الأطفال السوريين الذين هم بحاجة إلى رعاية لأسباب تتعلق بضعف التمويل، وخاصة الأطفال ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة. هناك تحدي في الوصول إلى المستفيدين المنتشرين في داخل المجتمع، وأيضا هناك تشنجات بدأت تظهر بين اللاجئين والمجتمع المضيف، وهذا لا يغيب عن أحد ناهيك عن الوضع السياسي في لبنان. هنا أمام هذا الواقع أدركت الدولة ولا سيما وزارة الشؤون الاجتماعية أننا يجب أن ننتقل من مفهوم سد الحاجات والاستجابة إلى أزمة إلى مفهوم بناء النظام والاستفادة الإيجابية من هذه الأزمة المؤلمة في كل نواحيها، بأن تسعى الدولة إلى بناء نظام حماية وبنية تحتية يبقى بخدمة الأطفال حتى بعد انتهاء الأزمة، وحتى لو تعرض وطننا لبنان الذي اعتاد الأزمات لأزمات جديدة. وكانت ترى أنه من الضروري توسيع شبكة شراكاتها مع المجتمع المدني، وأيضا تفعيل المشاريع التي تطبقها وزارة الشؤون الاجتماعية لجعلها متناسقة لمواجهة هذه الأزمة، ولا سيما على صعيد حماية الطفل والمرأة. وهذا احتاج إلى زيادة عدد العاملين، إلى رفع مستواهم وأهليتهم، وإضافة إلى الإكثار من حملات التوعية على الحماية، والعمل طبعا على استقطاب المزيد من المساعدات لتخفيف آثار الأزمة، إذ أن مالية الدولة لا تكفي للقيام بحاجات الشعب اللبناني، فكيف بنصفه إضافة موجودين على الأراضي اللبنانية. أمام هذا الواقع وضعت وزارة الشؤون الاجتماعية بدعم من اليونيسف خطة اسمتها الخطة الوطنية لحماية النساء والأطفال، وكانت قائمة على مبدأ الشراكة بين الحكومة والمجتمع الدولي والمجتمع المدني والمؤسسات المدنية. هذه الخطة تهدف وبدأنا بتنفيذها إلى الوصول إلى حوالي 198 ألف طفل لتأمين الخدمات الصحية والأساسية مع المتابعة النفسية والاجتماعية. حوالي 265 ألف سيستفيدون من تحسين مستوى الخدمات الصحية بشكل عام والأدوية. لافتة النظر أن هذه الخطة تطبق من خلال 57 مركز من مراكز الخدمات الاجتماعية المنتشرة على الأراضي اللبنانية التي تم انتقاؤها حسب الأماكن الأكثر فقرا والأكثر تواجدا للأزمة السورية، لأن الفقر يجر الفقر، فنحن معظم اللاجئين موجودين في الأماكن الفقيرة في لبنان. نحاول أن ندرك 410,000 إنسان أو شخص يستفيد من حلقات التوعية، نظام الإحالة الذي يتم بناؤه والخدمات الناتجة عنه. نسعى إلى تقوية أجهزة وزارة الشؤون والعاملين فيها حيث سيتناول التأهيل والدعم حوالي 430 موظف وموظفة، وما نسعى إليه أن تكون هذه الخطة جزءا من منظومة الدولة وجزءا من منظومة وتركيبة وزارة الشؤون لتبقى وتصبح دائمة وليست فقط خطة استجابة كما أشرت. أما حاولنا ونعمل على تأمين شراكات فاعلة مع المجتمع المدني والمحلي لهذه الخطة، إذ أن الدولة وحدها غير قادرة على تغطية الحاجات. كما أننا تطرقنا إلى مواضيع على كثير من الحساسية من الناحية السياسية أو من الناحية الأمنية والمتعلقة بتدخل الأطفال في النزاعات المسلحة واستغلالهم في هذا الموضوع، وخاصة بعد كثرة التنظيمات الإرهابية. وحاولنا من هذه الخطة أن نعطي صورة نموذجية عن التعاون بين المجتمع المحلي، بين الدولة وبين المؤسسات الدولية ولا سيما اليونيسف، حيث تحول فريق العمل إلى فريق واحد متحد ولم نعد منظمات تنصب ما بينها. لا أريد أن أطيل، سأنتقل فورا إلى ماذا نحتاج. طبعا المزيد من التمويل. أنا أعلم وأقر أن التربية أساسية، ولكن إذا قارنا ما يصرف من ميزانيات على قطاع التعليم نسبة إلى قطاع الحماية نجد أن قطاع الحماية الأطفال مظلوم، ولا تعليم بدون حماية للطفل وتوعية على حقوقه. فالانتهاكات تحصل في جميع المدارس وليس فقط في الطرقات وفي أماكن التجمعات. يجب أن نعمل جميعا وأن تعمل الدولة أيضا وإضافة إلى تفعيل نظام الحماية القضائية والاجتماعية وتفعيل قدرات المؤسسات التي تستقبل الأطفال وتساعدهم، ولا سيما مؤسسات الأطفال ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة التي تتطلب رعايتهم تكاليف عالية. يجب أن نفعل أكثر أنظمتنا الرقابية ومحاولة تجنيب الأنشطة الإغاثية وأنشطة الحماية التدخلات السياسية وإسقاطها بالنزاعات. أنا أنطلق من واقعنا في لبنان. رفع مستوى التنسيق وتبادل التجارب الناجحة ولا سيما بين دول المجتمع، بين دولنا نحن العالم العربي، فنوفر على بعضنا البعض إضاعة الوقت في خوض تجارب قد تكون فاشلة. ونحن اليوم في وزارة الشؤون بدأنا هذه الخطوة بمحاولة التعاون والاستفادة من تجربة المملكة الهاشمية الأردنية من جهة الخط الساخن، حيث نعمل على إطلاق خط ساخن تابع لوزارة الشؤون. يجب أن نوسع إطار العمل في صعيد الوزارة الشؤون، أن لا نكتفي بتقديم الخدمات في المراكز، بل نحاول أن ندرك المستفيدين بأماكن تواجدهم وأن نخرج بمناهج وآليات موحدة. نحن نتعاطى، إذا تطلعنا إلى الأزمة السورية يجب أن نبقي في أذهاننا أن هذا الشعب السوري الذي هو منتشر على قطاع الأراضي العربية سيعود يوما إلى بلده، فإذا تعلم يجب أن يكون منهجه موحد، وإذا تدرب على الحماية وعلى الوصول على حقوقه يجب أن تكون واحدة، حتى عندما يعود إلى وطنه لا يصبح فئات بثقافات مختلفة. سنسعى إلى رفع عدد المراكز التي شملتها الخطة لتغطي وتؤمن تغطية أفضل وفعالة أكثر. المهم أن نعطي، وهذا أظن الكل يوافق عليه، أن يعطى الأطفال دور أكبر في اتخاذ القرارات المتعلقة بهم والمناهج التي تعطى لهم ووسائل التي نستعملها، والوقوف عند آرائهم وحاجاتهم وتجاربهم، ووضع الآليات لتمكينهم من ممارسة هذا الحق. أخيراً، دعم المجتمعات المضيفة. جميع المجتمعات المضيفة هي مجتمعات فقيرة مرهقة، وإحدى أسباب الحزازات الأساسية هو الشعور بالظلم. اليوم أنا بس بدي أشير، في لبنان بدأ بعض الشباب اللبناني يشتري جوازات سفر سورية مزورة ليغادر إلى دول أوروبا مع البعثات التي تستقبلها الدول الأوروبية. فهذه فقط رسالة لنرى ما هو الواقع. فالمجتمع المضيف إذا أردناه أن يصمد ويقدم فعلينا أن ندعمه. وأخيرا أختم بالقول أن وجودنا هنا في مؤتمر ترعاه مؤسسات دولية وتساهم فيه مؤسسات دولية هو رسالة إلى وعي المجتمع الدولي لدوره، ولكن آمل من المجتمع الدولي أن لا يتطلع إلى الأزمة السورية وأزمة عالمنا العربي من واجبه كمساعد، ولكن من دوره كشريك في هذه الأزمة أسوة بكافة الدول العربية. ولا أقصد من الناحية الإنسانية، إنما أقصد من الناحية السياسية. فالواجب على المجتمع الأوروبي ليس فقط المساندة، إنما أن يلعب دوره كشريك أساسي في الأزمة وفي حل الأزمة السورية. إذا لم تحل الأزمة السورية لا مجال لأن نستوعب المزيد من الأطفال مهما وضعنا أنظمة، مهما وضعنا أسس حماية، مهما عملنا. وشكرا.
Thank you so much, Mr. Karami. One point I think it's worth reflecting on as we continue with our last two speakers is the issue of that Mr. Karami raised, that even preceding this crisis, people were hopeless, young people were despairing in many countries in the region. In fact, a report from Arab Barometer suggested that in 2013, up to a third of young people between the ages of 18 and 25 in many Middle East and North African countries were already planning to migrate. So the Syrian crisis has only exacerbated the fault lines that were there previously. So I think it's an extremely important point that you raised, Mr. Karami. Thank you. I'm going to move on to our final two speakers. We have Craissati next, who's the thematic advisor for child protection at Save the Children Fund based in Sweden. Chiara, the floor is yours.
So, in the next few minutes, I wanted to give two main concepts. And one is to set the frame of what the North generation is telling us on child protection strategies to address child protection concerns in Syria and neighboring countries, and then giving you some highlights from a report on child labor in the Syria Crisis that the UNICEF and Save the Children published earlier this year. So, when it comes to the North generation and what this frame is telling us on how we could address child protection concerns for Syrian children, is mainly looking at three aspects. The first one is building access to quality community-based child protection services. So really working closely with the communities and involving communities in telling us what the needs are and what the solutions would be. And secondly, looking at specialized child protection intervention and services for the most vulnerable children who would be in need, for instance, of family-based alternative care, legal aid, referrals to specialized services. And finally, strengthening national formal child protection systems. So looking at laws, policies, and working with the formal system in place in the countries where we work. There are also three main cross-cutting strategies that are common to these three child protection strategies and that will support all our work and is looking at integrated approaches, and so how we child protection actors we can also start looking into more strategic collaborations with other sectors, and that foremost with education and livelihoods to try to address those main child protection issues. At the same time looking at evidence generation, and so demonstrating how our interventions are effective to address these concerns, and building an advocacy component that we realized was somehow missing in our first No Lost generation. Now, we look at child labor as one of those negative coping mechanisms that are being used by Syrian families, mainly linked to the deterioration and the loss of livelihoods in many of these situations. And in this report that is compiling a series of data on child labor in the Syria crisis, we see that children are starting to work at a very young age. So we know, for instance, that almost 18% of Syrian refugee children in Jordan working in agriculture are starting working at below the age of 12. We see that many of the children who are working are exposed to greater risk of exploitation, violence, and abuse. And this was really common speaking to children. What the report says is that many reported both verbal and physical abuse while working. It looks like that most of children working are male, but we also need to recognize that girls' labor might be unreported or less visible. And so making girls at risk of greater risk of abuse and also sexual abuse, where girls are mainly involved in domestic labor, for instance. And finally, we see that the consequences of work, of harmful work on children, are widespread and long-lasting. For instance, one of the data in the report says that 70% of children working in a Craissati camp in Jordan were reporting health problems. If we look at the reasons behind child labor in the Syria crisis, we see that the first reason reported by children, because they are working, is to support their family survival. Where, for instance, in Iraq, nearly 77% of refugees from children from Syria say that they are working to support their family. Same for the 36% of children in Jordan. The limited access to education is making child labor even worse. We know that the children who are out of school are at greater risk of being involved in child labor, and at the same time children who are working are at greater risk of dropping out from school if they are in school. And this is going to be a big issue where, as we said before, the 50% of children, of Syrian children in neighboring countries are out of school at the moment. And the limited legal status also increases the vulnerability of refugee families and also the risk of falling in negative coping mechanisms such as child labor. What we know from general studies, and I'm now referring to a study that was conducted in 2012 by the CARP, the Women Refugee Commission, the Child Protection Crisis Network, and Save the Children. And although we need further evidence to say that there are causal link between livelihoods intervention and outcomes of protection on children in emergency situations, we can say so far that, for instance, conditional cash transfers in a child labor program are effective as they address poverty and economic vulnerability. And this is particularly true when there are also other services available that the children can access. We know that cash transfers can improve children's well-being by reducing the caregiver stress in meeting their survival needs. And we have examples from other sectors where that they lead to believe that there are positive outcomes from using libraries intervention and cash transfers, for instance, in education and nutrition programs. And we also see that the use of these interventions is much less effective when for the worst forms of child labor, where, for instance, child recruitment, where reasons are not just linked to a livelihood situation, but we need to look further. And I would like to use this consideration just to introduce what my colleague Sukru is going to present on how child labor can be addressed in a comprehensive way in the Syria crisis.
Thank you so much, Chiara. I'll just use the opportunity to highlight the report that Chiara has mentioned called Small Hands, Heavy Burden, which goes into the detail. Chiara also mentioned the point about NLG now focusing on higher level advocacy. And one of the comments from Dina's presentation earlier that you may have missed because it was in a slide with a lot of other points on it, is the issue that we're seeing across the Syria crisis, but in several other crises in the region, for the first time in this systematic way that's this widespread, the deliberate targeting of schools, educational infrastructure, teachers and students. And I just draw your attention to another report called Education Under Fire that highlights this phenomenon, showing that there are around 13 million children out of school due to conflicts across the Middle East and North Africa today as a direct result of educational systems being under attack. And it's a phenomenon I think we all need to talk about much more vigorously and publicly in the wars with all parties to the conflict at fault. So last but not least, we're going to have our last panelist, Sukru Chianzigulu, who's the Regional Protection Coordinator at UNHCR. Thanks, Sukru.
Thank you very much. It's actually a pleasure to be here at the last speaker, of having been informed actually some of the issues that I'm going to say today, as already spoken by my esteemed panelists. In fact, child labor is only one example where we can really look at the issue, how the child protection, education, and livelihood issues do in fact come together. And so we will not be in a position to address them if we don't really look at this comprehensively in an integrated way. When we are talking about a legal policy framework, we also talk about communities, education, and specialized child protection services that comes along with it. But let me go back to first issue, legal and policy framework, which has been actually Dr. Khawla emphasized. It is extremely important to have a legal and policy framework that do not really discriminate of any kind on the status or the refugees or the nationality. And so we need to really look for the inclusion of refugee children as well in the national action plans when we try to really address the child labor. And sometimes not only the legal but also the policy interventions. We need to really look at how we will be in the position to offer viable alternatives to children. As Chiara actually mentioned that it's 77% of the children do indeed in Iraq need to work in order to support their families. Is there a viable way that we can actually offer something else? And there is also, as mentioned by Jane, that there is also expectations maybe, that sometimes social norms and attitudes do play quite a lot of issues here. We will not be in the position to address them if we do not really also recognize those ones. And how we can really challenge those social norms and sometimes the policies at a high level, the way that we actually encode them in the laws and the legal framework do in fact provide us opportunity to respond. With communities, as we spoke, it is extremely interesting when we talk about adolescents and refugee children, about their aspirations. And we need to really see
how the specific needs of the families and the children with working children are actually considered. How we can actually reach them, how we can really understand their concerns, and how we can really support the existing community-based structures addressing child labor. Well, we would like to really see that despite the enormity of the scale of the child labor that we observe today in the region, there are a lot of champions, those that are actually trying to really prevent this happening. We need to identify those ones in the communities. And when we are talking about the communities, not necessarily the refugee communities, talking with the host communities, talking with the other groups that are actually looking at this. And we need to engage with them in order to really respond to this more comprehensively. And it is, as Dina also said, the safe and appropriate education opportunities, accessing, strengthening the systems is extremely important. We need to really move towards formal secondary education opportunities. How we can really engage them? The education that actually delivers diplomas, that they are recognized and allow them to fully utilize their future. We need to really address the violence and discrimination in schools, which is one of the main reasons why the children in fact drop out from the school. We need to look at the alternative non-formal education. Because once a child is working, it is really difficult sometimes for them to expect to go to the formal education. So what can we really offer them to help them, to reach them as education and opportunities, despite the fact or while they are actually working? So how we can really look at those ones? And of course, we need to really look at the technical and the vocational training offerings that we have in the system, in the countries. Do they really match to what the market's needs are? Do we really basically addressing where there is a need and the skills do in fact match? And as we said, that it is nothing more important than to be able to look at the basic numeracy and literacy skills. This is the basic. But sometimes we also see that years of dropping out of the school, some of these skills are not as strong as we want to believe. We need to really see and find a way to adapt to their needs and availability of those ones. So one thing is, again, education should remain available for all children, even if they work, and we need to find a way to do so. Specialized child protection services. As it was mentioned that the systems building is extremely important. We cannot really let these child protection and education services go alone if we do not really strengthen the capacity of the partners and the government. And once we will be in the position to do so, indeed, we will be in the position to better, in a timely and effective manner, actually respond to child labor. Last but not least is the child-sensitive livelihood programs. We are in the region, the 3 RP partners, they scale up the livelihood programs that benefit all vulnerable persons. But we need to also advocate for employment opportunities for refugees. It is not only reason, but it is an important element. Today, when we talk about 86% of the Syrian refugees do in fact live in a poverty line in Jordan and a similar way in Lebanon. We need to design livelihood programs that specifically address some of the key elements of the child labor. And these should be safe livelihoods programs for children above legal working age. We know that there will be. So how we can really provide a better, a safer environment for them to really work, and how we can really target the most vulnerable families with heightened risk of child labor. And while we do this, I just want to bring up to Chiara. The cash assistance and vouchers to vulnerable families are an important way of doing it. But also, if it's together done with the specialized child protection services. And we need to refine the modalities to cash assistance targets so that it effectively reduces of child labor. We need to look at this, measure it, and we would like to see it that is happening. And of course, exploring expansion of conditional cash transfers to support the children to return to school. in Egypt, in other places, back to school campaigns are a perfect example for this. Thank you very much.
Just a moment, but I think what you've heard is really that this crisis, which may now be the archetypical protracted crisis spawning the biggest human population movement since World War II, is challenging us. It's challenging us as an international community, it's challenging host governments, it's challenging our thinking about how to deal with challenges of this scale. It's also spawning a series of innovations. And I think the NLG has certainly been one of those. And you've heard some of the programming behind the label that I think really we can build on in the next phase of NLG. We've also seen both the huge generosity of host governments in the region, of the international donor community, but as well the fact that the system is straining at the seams. It can no longer cope. So we need ideas from all of you, and I know we have a tremendous audience actually with enormous expertise from donor governments, UN, civil society, host governments, and the private sector, and many colleagues who know well in leadership positions across the region. So I'd like to open the floor. I'd like to start with our colleague from UNRWA, Niels Raymond, who wants to also make some parallels with UNRWA's work in regards to one of the other protracted crises in this region, perhaps the longest of all, the Palestinian situation. You can use the podium if the mic's not working. We will need a mic, though, organisers, for questions, so hope we can fix the mic in the meantime.
No. No.
That's it.
Yes. No. Thank you very much.
Can you hear in the back?
No.
Now is it working there?
Yes.
Thank you very much. From the point of view of UNRWA, and unencumbered by any presentation or any speech to be given, I just wanted to take the next step to what has been presented to now. UNRWA has been operating for over 65 years now on a protracted crisis. So many of the issues that are being raised here are issues that we have been dealing with, or my agency has been dealing with for a number of years. And so we can only just validate a lot of the issues that are raised here, which are even more exacerbated for Palestine refugees who are already in a more fragile position as not having mobility to ground or any protection guarantees. Currently, UNRWA is providing education for 500,000 students across 4 countries. There are 700 schools, a number of TVET centers, there are 8. We have been in Syria suffering greatly, but we're still, while we started off with 67 children in our schools, we come back to 46,000 after a drop. This is basically linked to the problem of being refugees for the second time. And so what I'd like to echo here is we're talking about 5 years. We're looking at the first cohort of children who have been born outside of their countries. And the accreditation problems that Dina has brought up is exacerbated by protection problems in terms of identity and paperwork. These are issues that we work with still into our the 3rd generation of refugees. So there's nothing but to validate a lot of the issues that we brought here, the challenges that are being faced. In terms of our lessons on how to go forward, basically education, what has been brought up as the main demand from the youth as being education, is certainly a finding for Palestine refugees. And if you look at our program at UNRWA now, over 75% of our overall program and staff is for education. That is not just a decision, that is actually dynamic after a decision. And it's really our biggest program. And the quality of our program is what is we see and our partners see as the driving factor to resilience. It is really about a quality program that delivers what the students need. The latest reform, the education reform that was launched in 2011, is taking the road to a lot of the recommendations that have been brought up in the low-loss generation discussions and making it more child-centered, trying to inspire critical thinking, to inspire higher order thinking skills. These are the elements which we need to bring forward. Strengthening the resilience and strengthening education systems can only be echoed by what we're living through in UNRWA, using structured education systems while we innovate and do self-learning materials in partnership with other agencies, and we use them as best possible. They will never replace a structured education accredited system. And we have to make clear that while we're making progress on non-formal, we have to keep on strengthening our systems. As you'll note, many of you have heard in the last few months, UNRWA has been challenged financially, and one of the big risks we had over the summer were our schools not opening. And this is something which our Commissioner General has echoed around, and while we did open our schools, we're faced with continuing challenges in financing our education systems. I could just emphasize again that we need to maintain the systems. There are no true valid alternatives to the education systems, even though we do deliver on a formal basis. And what we've managed to do, and the partnership which the NLG is representing a portion of, the partnerships are really what has made UNRWA achieve where we are now. UNESCO has been part of the founding of the education program of UNRWA and has been providing technical assistance on a consistent basis. UNICEF has been working very closely with UNRWA for a number of years in the context of our fields. So the partnerships that are represented here, we've never saved, and I say a number of partners, that is coming into on a common approach, common framework, is the one lesson which I would want to echo from UNRWA's part. Thank you very much.
Certainly a lot to learn from the UNRWA experience and indeed from the Palestinian crisis over many decades. And clearly also, I think many of you working in countries outside Syria, I know we have Lise Grande here, for example, the DSRSG from Iraq, will recognize that these issues are of course relevant to Syrian refugees, but are also extremely relevant to countries like Iraq per se. And I think many of you across the region will recognize these issues are common issues, and the concepts of NLG do apply to many other countries and situations across the region. Okay, let's hear from this distinguished audience. We'll take questions. If you could please introduce yourself by name and organization, and just tell me who you'd like to direct your question towards. I'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time. I have the gentleman in the front row, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks also to the speakers for excellent presentations. My name is Mohammed Hamdan. I'm a Jordanian educator. I present a fund. I'm senior advisor for the Arab Open University, which is established by AgFund, which is the Arab Gulf Program for Development. Sir, we all know that there is no good substitute for formal education at the school level. We heard from Ms. Dina that they have a program of online education. However, this is not accredited or recognized because there is no good substitute for the proper school environment, and this is understandable. However, perhaps a blended open online learning approach could be a compromise between the formal education and the online education, in which Jordan has stretched its capacity to the limits with, the schooling, the classrooms, and the, two-stage teaching at every school. But if we use the weekends for partial, face-to-face, blended open learning education, wouldn't that be possible? It is used at the university level, not at the school level, but because of the difficult circumstances, we could do that. The other question is that also Ms. Jane had mentioned about students in Daraa are striving to, a small percentage, to have university education. We know that there are a number of private schools in Daraa governorate, which if provided with some support, they will be able to increase the capacity of high school students to go into these private universities. I would like to have a comment on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I'll take at least 2 or 3 more in this batch. Have the gentleman in the front row, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much to the distinguished panelists. I'm Frank Hagemann. I'm the acting regional director for the ILO. I was happy to see that so much room was given to the issue of child labor. In the past, child labor was often treated as a kind of collateral damage, of these crises, as something inevitable, and which would then somehow go away once you get all kids into school. We know and we have seen that is not the case, and I was particularly pleased to, by what I heard from Chiara and from Shuku, in terms of what needs to be brought to the fore, not only from the education side, but from the through cash transfers, protection, etc. And if I may add to that, you need to act at the enterprise, often farm level actually, because much of the child labor is happening in agriculture. You need to work with employers, and you cannot just shun them and treat them as a bad boys out there. You need to work with them in order to be able to better protect children. And in the past, I think many of us in the UN have taken a rather maximalist approach. Meaning, we wanted to withdraw kids from work and wanted to get them into school. I think given the limited means these days, we have to realize that we have to be very pragmatic, meaning that kids will, in the foreseeable future, many of these refugee kids will have to combine school and work, given the livelihood needs. What matters there is to better protect them at work, to reduce the hazards at work, to reduce the hours that they work, and enable them to still, make work manageable in a way that they can still attend school. One last thing, you mentioned the importance of policy and to adapt national frameworks, national action plans to the new realities. I think, again, very important point, that both Jordan as well as Lebanon have had very little child labor. Jordan could have been a success case, eliminating at least the worst forms of child labor, but there's a great deal of experience in dealing with child labor in both countries. Both have national frameworks, both have national policies, yet they do not take refugees into account yet. They were formulated before, and now as we are moving from humanitarian, response towards resilience, it is time to look towards the medium term and adopt these policies. Thank you very much.
Excellent points. Thank you, Frank. Yes, the lady on the right-hand side here.
Hi, I'm Frances Charles, the Regional Advocacy Director at World Vision. I want to echo thank you to all the panellists for your contributions. I wanted to talk about one of the really important pillars of NLG, and that's the third pillar of youth. And it was thank you, Jane, for your presentation on that. I think what we really want to make sure that we use this Resilience Development Forum as an opportunity to move beyond looking just at livelihoods for youth and think this is not enough to empower youth as peace builders for the future. And I think my question would be, are we giving enough thought to youth beyond just the question of livelihoods and looking at economic security for youth? How are we looking at empowering them with the skills they need, not just as refugees in the host countries, but also inside Syria itself? Have we done enough in the 3RP to address this programmatically? Are we asking the right questions at international levels and putting enough emphasis on that? I want to know, Jane, if you think this is something that we need to be doing more research on, or is it just a question of taking those researches and really making them operationally sound in the 3RP and what we're doing at the moment? Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. I'll take one more. Call into a question. Yes, gentleman in the second row.
Morning, everybody. صباح الخير. I'm سليمان العوضي. سليمان العوضي من منظمة التعاون الإسلامي. في الحقيقة طالما نحن بضيافة UNDP وهيئة التنمية وخطاب طرحنا مشكلة التعليم والشراكة الموسعة. فأنا بدي أذكر شيء معين، ألا وهو أن كيفية إشراك القطاع الخاص والNGOs والحكومات في الدفع في العملية التعليمية وكذلك في العملية التنموية. نحن تطرقنا للتعليم من جانب واحد هو الجانب النظري، ولكن هناك التعليم التقني. ذكر المتحدث من لبنان قال لابد من ثقافة واحدة تعود مرة أخرى بدل الثقافات الأخرى. فإذا لابد يكون التعليم متكامل من الجهة النظرية ومن الجهة التقنية. لذلك لابد من إشراك القطاع الخاص والحكومات والNGOs لتحقيق هذا الهدف المشروع في التعليم. وشكرا.
Excellent. We'll start, I think, with Jane, if you don't mind, taking the question on young people beyond employment, beyond livelihoods. What do we need to do to engage young people, Jane?
Do you know, some of the biggest and most commonest themes of thought that come from young people is that they actually don't have a voice. So we come back to the context of how do we give young people a voice. And so it's all very well for us to use the language of advocacy platforms, but actually what does that really mean? And so, and I appreciate what Save the Children was saying, certainly for NLG1, there wasn't such a focus on how we give young people a voice. Certainly for NLG2, there is absolutely that focus now. But I think that before we give young people a voice, and I heard someone mention this before, you know, we've done some amazing assessments around the world for this reason, for this region. But there's some really critical areas. Before you give young people a voice, young people first have to, and I'm saying this very generally, so I mean no offense, but young people actually need to learn how to think for themselves, because we have generations of young people who actually have the rhetoric of the families and the tribes, and part of what they're looking for is, yes, a voice, but how do you get a voice unless you begin to understand how to think for yourself, how to think critically? How do you actually then take that new language and that new context of thought and put it into an open arena? And it might even be as simple as something as debating. You know, like it might even be as simple as, how do we really take this wonderful platform language and bring it down to the grassroots level? I truly think that in NLG 2 and 3, perfect timing to do it, all right? And I think that it's actually something that we need to make very practical. We need to have very liquid solutions, because, and I use that term because inside Syria, it's not always easy to think about the things that we can do in Lebanon and Jordan, for example. So how do we stop talking about, oh, we can't do it, and how do we start talking about how can we do it inside Syria in particular? So I would like to see some really basic beginnings, and in our education and in our informal education processes, absolutely, we're starting to look at how we can do that. How can we give young people an opportunity to do their own research, to form their own opinions, to have a voice? I think it's well timed.
Thanks,
and I really think we need to stop using this language that means nothing, like advocacy platform. What does that mean for kids?
Thanks, Jane. I'm going to ask Fehmi if you could comment related to this point, but most importantly related to the point from our private sector colleague Salama about the role of technical and vocational training and how private sector can be involved in those aspects.
يعني أنا بس بدي كمل الفكرة اللي أضافتها زميلتي وقول إشراك الأطفال، يعني خليني أحكي على صعيد لبنان. إشراك الأطفال وسماع صوتهم طبعا بحاجة إلى يعني بنية، ولكن أيضا بحاجة إلى تثقيف المجتمع لتقبل هذا الرأي وسماعه. نحن بمجتمعاتنا فكرة الشراك والاستماع بحاجة بعد إلى نضج أكثر وإتاحة بالمجال إلى أكثر. نحن بلبنان في عنا تجربة بمشروع مع الدولة الإيطالية بإنشاء مجالس بلديات أطفال، وكانت تجربة أنا بعتبرها رائدة وناجحة في بعض البلديات بالتعاون مع وزارة الشؤون بتمويل من الحكومة الإيطالية. أنشأوا مجالس رديفة للبلديات، وأصبحت هذه المجالس تعطي رأيها ببعض الأمور لتتعلق بالعمل البلدي الذي يمس الأطفال. ونحن هلا كوزارة شؤون عم نحاول نستفيد من هذه المجالس، بما أنه بدأت عند الآلية أن ننتقل أكثر للشراكة أكثر بإعطاء رأي. بالنسبة للشراكة بين الحكومة والقطاع الخاص، أنا بعتقد هذا شيء أساسي جدا. وزارة الشؤون قامت فيه من خلال مثل ما أشرت بالخطة الوطنية، وأنا هون بدي ضوي على فكرة أساسية. الشراكة لا تقوم على أنه أنه فريق يأخذ دور فريق آخر أو أخص فريق دون الآخر، ولكن الشراكة تقوم على أن يبقى للدولة الحق بوضع السياسات الأساسية، وبتصير تشترك المجتمع المدني بوضع هذه السياسات وتنفيذها، ويصبح كل شريك يعرف دوره، وبالتالي نتحول من أنشطة خاصة وإلى نشاط تراكمي يبنى على أساسه منظومة متكاملة اللي بعتقد أجمع الكل إنه نحن بحاجة إلى نظام سيستم، مش إلى فقط استجابة لحالة اعتداء أو طفل معنف. لا، نحن بدنا نظام الإحالة، بدنا منظومة قضائية، بدنا نظام قضائي. شكرا.
Thank you so much, Fehmi. I'm going to ask Dina and Dr. Khawla to look at this related issue of informal versus formal. I think it's an interesting point that we can make on this topic, because if we look, of course, purely from an educational standpoint, one can question sometimes the value of the informal side, as our colleague from the Arab Open University has done. And yet, if we start to look at the multi-sectoral approaches that are inherent to the NLG, and the role of child protection, the role of youth engagement, perhaps the justification for more work on informal becomes more clear. But let me ask Dina and Dr. Khawla if you could address that issue of informal versus formal. How do we see the role of online and blended education? Maybe Dina first.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يعني ربما يمكن لنا الأردن تجربة وخبرة في هذه المجالات، وبالتالي هناك كان بكل برنامج عندنا برنامج اللي هو المهارات الحياتية، وكان في مؤسسات المجتمع المدني في شراكة حقيقية. وإحنا بوزارة التربية والتعليم عادة بنشرف على كل المهارات اللي تقدم للأطفال واليافعين في جميع مؤسساتنا. هناك كما قلت سابقا انه هناك في عندنا معامله جميع الطلبه من اي بلدان بنفس المعامله، وبالتالي في عندنا في مدارسنا في اللي هو مجالس التطوير التربوي. ومجالس التطوير هي مجالس في كل حي بيكون في عندنا اباء وامهات مشرفين معلمين بيقودوا العملية التعليمية داخل المدرسة، بيحكوا آرائهم. وهذا ضمن برنامج من 5 سنين تم تدريب جميع مدراء المدارس على هذا البرنامج وتطوير المدرسة والمديرية. الآن في هذه الأزمة السورية والمدارس اللي هي باعتبار الدبل شيفت، والمدارس اللي فيها طلاب سوريين وأردنيين، الآن هناك أيضا أولياء أمور سوريين هم مشتركين في هذه المجالس، وبالتالي بيعطوا يعني آرائهم واقتراحاتهم. وهناك أيضا في عندنا مجالس الطلبة، وفي عندنا مجالس أولياء الأمور، وأيضا هي ما بتفرق ما بين أولياء الأمور الأردنيين أو السوريين. وفي عندنا شغلة يعني حبيت أذكرها وأشكر الأخ اللي من لبنان، احنا عندنا الخط الساخن موجود مش بس في مدارسنا وبتلقى كل الشكاوي والحالات الإساءة والعنف، أيضا احنا الآن يعني في داخل المخيمات وبنتابعه احنا بشكل يعني حثيث، والتقينا قبل فترة بكل المدراء اللي موجودين في المخيمات، لأنه احنا سياسة وزارة التربية والتعليم القطاع التعليمي في كل مكان هو نفس السياسة، سواء في حماية الأطفال سواء كانوا أردنيين أو غير أردنيين. ويعني هو لسه كمان الطلبة السوريين هو جزء لا يتجزأ، احنا كمان الآن عم بردنا أعداد كبيرة من الطلبة اليمنيين الملتحقين، هناك أيضا من جنسيات أخرى. يعني هذا البلد احنا الأردن يعني نستقبل أعداد كبيرة من اللاجئين، ونضطر أن نتعامل مع الحالة كما هي. بس للأمانة نحن بحاجة إلى يعني دعم كبير، لأنه إحنا كما تعرفون أن أصلا لدينا يعني مشكلة في البنية التحتية وفي التعليم، وبالتالي أعتقد أن هذا سيؤثر على جودة التعليم لدينا، ونحن نعمل يعني من 100 سنة على التقدم في التعليم، فكل مشكلة تؤثر بشكل جزئي، وأرجو أن لا يؤثر ذلك بحيث أنه يعني على الأقل نستطيع المحافظة على الجودة الموجودة لدينا. شكرا.
First, with regards to the dichotomy between formal and non-formal education, in principle, this dichotomy shouldn't exist, and both pathways, let's call them pathways, should be part of one system. And non-formal education should be of good quality as much as formal education should be of good quality. And you have sometimes systems where formal education is not of good quality and non-formal is, and vice versa. And you have also situations where both pathways are not of good quality. Non-formal education comes up when children are not capable to join the formal system because the formal system doesn't take them, because they have lost years of schooling, because they are marginalized, or because of crisis and war situations. What we should be striving at is that the pathway of the non-formal education is of good quality and leads to transitions to formal. Why? Because children and in fact need a structured education, at least at the post-basic levels, the first 9 years of schooling, with a certificate. This is also a basic right. What does it mean to have a good quality formal or non-formal education? It's through a skills approach that doesn't just convey knowledge to children that they don't look at critically, but conveys knowledge to children on the basis of skills, cognitive skills, analytical skills, critical thinking skills, social awareness skills, personal empowerment skills, and also human rights. It's all one package, and this is what we should strive for, not only for the Syrian children, but also for all host community children. That's what I meant, that we need to invest in the future within the framework of the education in NLG by promoting quality education for all children. So it would be erroneous, and it wouldn't help us if we categorize non-formal as something and formal as something else. And this brings us back to the question you raised on online learning. In fact, the online learning, or we talk about, and here what we mean by it is the portability of learning, meaning that Syrian children, wherever they go, they can take their school with them, and Syrian children, wherever they go, they can have an exam and a certificate within this school. So how to do it? It's to put it in the cloud, whereby a child can register, can be assessed, can follow a class according to his or her rhythm, and can take a certificate at the end. This is possible. It's very complicated because we need legal frameworks to provide the certification and to qualify the learning of the children. But as we say, non-formal education can be of a good quality that can be also of good quality and must. All children, including the Syrian children, deserve it. And this is where, through an online learning, the dichotomy between formal and non-formal disappears. Because if you give a child a structured education that has its certificate, we are talking about formal education and effect. And what we mean by it, it's a blended approach. Children, whatever form of online learning, and the children we target are marginalized children. They are not children who have computers in their homes. So they must go somewhere and have access to a computer and to learning through facilitators. But this is, the online learning makes it more flexible, so we can use double shift, we can use 2 hours that a school gives us here and there, and we can scale up the access.
Thanks so much, Dina. We're going to take 1 or 2 last comments or questions from the floor, please. I have last burning points. I see a colleague in the second row on the left.
Hello, my name is Gaëtan Ducroux. I'm working for the European Commission. The EU has been one of the strong supporters of the education response of the whole and knowledge generation initiative. My question is more related to the status of the knowledge generation and this linkage with national plans, the current regional plans that are being developed. The status was not fully clear at the start of the initiative. It started as an advocacy initiative to mobilize more support to those, and then it became a kind of programmatic approach of how to respond. And my question is, what is the relation between the knowledge generation and all the ongoing process of planning the response?
Thank you so much. And I think there was a colleague on this side in the third row.
Thank you very much. I'm Flavio Lovisano of the Italian Cooperation. I think that as a donor representative, we have to recognize and to be aware that the effort made by Lebanon and Jordan is something particular. And I think that we as a donor community and international organization, we have often to underline how many children are already involved in the national system of education, and not only to underline how many are outside. Also, I think that something needed to be more done. I think that we have done some effort. We as Italian Cooperation, we support UNICEF, we support NGO, we intervene also directly just to rehabilitate some schools in Lebanon and Jordan, and we thank also Mr. Rachid that underlined even our effort just for the youth in some municipality. But I think that something needed to be more done, and probably exist linkages with the informal education and also the vocational training. I think that something needs to think about how to involve the private sector, even the small and medium enterprise, to collaborate with the international organization and with us in general as donor community, just to involve the youth, refugees and not refugees, in some trainings that could be even considered informal, but could be also very useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And there was a small comment. There was additionality in the row behind you.
Thank you. I'll keep it very short. Yannick Dupont from Spark from the Netherlands. My question is about how to get things together. We are funding some local councils in Syria. They're restarting 6 higher vocational schools and replacing students, a couple of hundred, soon maybe up to a few thousand, in universities in the region with scholarship program, regional scholarship program. So I was wondering, how do we connect that post-secondary level to the secondary level in an integrated way and in a practical way, working between the actors? And the second question is also the view of the speakers on shouldn't we now already heavily look at post-war reconstruction, where we select subjects that we're placing these kids in? And how do we basically start already preparing for the post-war phase, which will probably come at some point?
Inshallah. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to end with a final point. Please feel free to make it related to one of the audience's interventions if you want to. Otherwise, I'd like your point to really be a very specific one recommendation on the next phase of the No Lost Generation initiative. One recommendation only per panelist, because I want you really to prioritize and focus on what you think is the most important element in the next phase. Could I start with you, Sukru? But before you say anything, let me just respond to one issue, which was the coordination and planning. I think you'll all be reassured to know that all of us involved in the NLG from the outset have not wanted very deliberately to add to any of the significant planning burdens on the host government and all of the UN and NGO, private sector and international donor partners involved. So the NLG is fully embedded in the current 3RP, SRP, HRP processes. There's no additional planning or other infrastructure. It's all fully embedded in the M&E frameworks and all of the processes that already exist, including, of course, the national processes that ultimately the HRP and 3RP processes rest upon. So let me start with you, Sukru.
Thank you very much. I think I just want to go back to what Jane said. It's young people are facing to make tough decisions today, and we need to really make the situation as easy as possible for them. I think for NLG, it is important to really seize the opportunities that the response, the willingness, the generosity of the governments and the willingness of the communities and their resourcefulness could be really tapped into and translated into much stronger, regionally coherent but country-driven response plans that we would like to see.
Thank you so much. Jane? Into your mic, please.
I'm going to make it very simple. There's two things that sit when I think about young people. One is that if we don't give them the ability to think, to learn how to think, to learn how to express, then what we've done is we've continued a pathway where we're looking at, violent extremism, young people joining forces. Actually, they do this because one of the drivers out of that is that they actually don't have a voice. All right? So I think it's well timed for us to look at how we better integrate education, non-formal education. And I think that in order for us to do that, that means that the players on the ground actually have to stay open longer than 9 to 4 and have to actually start thinking about how we link into young people who are on the ground in the workforce, how we bring them in. So, I think, folks, it's a little bit of a combination, but unless we start to give people, young people, the ability and the space and the skills to learn to think, I worry.
Thank you. Fehmi.
أنا بصراحة بدي أرجع أكثر على شغلة كثير محددة. بدي أرجع على شغلة كثير محددة، إنه نأمن نظام إحالي يمكن الطفل يوصل صرخته إذا تعرض إلى الإساءة ويؤمن له الحماية بطريقة صحيحة. نحن هيدا من أهم أولوياتنا. أنا كشخص عم اشتغل بحماية الطفل والمرأة اللي عم نشتغل عليه بالوزارة، ودعمه والاستفادة من التجارب في الدول سواء برا أو دول العالم العربي شغلة كتير أساسية، ودعمه ماديا كمان شغلة كتير أساسية. ويعني معناتها أنا عم بدعي أنها تندعم الخطة الوطنية يلي هي موقعة بلبنان. شكرا.
Thank you so much, Fehmi. Dr. Khawla.
أنا كمان رح أحكي شغلة محددة بالتعليم. أنا أعتقد إنه يعني إذا بدنا إحنا نخلص من كل القلق اللي بيساورنا بالنسبة للطلبة، أنا أعتقد أن التعليم الرسمي هو الحل، لأنه في عندنا أعداد كبيرة من الطلبة في مرحلة التعليم الرسمي هو خارج الآن مقاعد الدراسة. التعليم الرسمي هو الأساس، والأمر ليس بالأمر الصعب. زيادة عدد غرف صفية وزيادة عدد المدارس المبنية، أعتقد أننا نحل جزء كبير من المشكلة اللي إحنا يعني منها نشكر.
I would like to build on what Dr. Khawla has mentioned and also Jane. And the recommendation is that all partners join their efforts more systematically and more forcefully to invest in quality education. And quality education not only meaning the instrumentalist perspective, that is that the children, even from their younger age, need to learn employability skills, need to learn how when they graduate they can get a job, but quality education also from the humanitarian and the humanist perspective, that is an education that is based on human rights, on positive values, on critical thinking, analytical skills, and that empowers young people and also children to look critically at what they learn, but be empowered also in their lives.
Thank you so much. And Kiara.
I think my desire for the next generation for this new phase is, as a child protection practitioner, to really start a deeper discussion with the colleagues from other sectors and looking at the protection issues faced by Syrian children in a holistic way. And so sitting at the table with the colleagues from education, livelihoods, and looking at all the aspects of how we can all work together to solve things.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the panel and to the audience. Let me just bear with me for 2 or 3 minutes while I try and capture some of the salient points. It's been a very rich and diverse discussion. Here we go. I've got 8 points. The first is an introduction that it's very clear that an entire generation is at risk due to the crisis in Syria and surrounding countries, and that the protracted crisis continues to underscore huge vulnerabilities for societies at large, but particularly for children and young people. The first point is that neighbouring states are indeed bearing the burden of that, but they're stretched to the limit. They need further support from the international community and from all of us as partners, so that this straining doesn't result in further tensions and instability in the host countries themselves. We need the leadership of the host governments, clearly, as we embark on the next phase, which is more long-term in thinking, which will require strategic plans, strategic frameworks, policy shifts, coordination, monitoring and evaluation systems, and a focus on standardization. The second point is on education. It's clear from all of the views, expert practitioners, young people themselves, everything we've heard today, that education remains a top priority for our response. Our colleague from the Italian Corporation reminded us that it's not all bad news. There are indeed 1.5 million children that would not be in school today who are there because of our collective efforts. However, 2.7 million children are out of school because the needs keep growing, because the crisis keeps expanding. But it is complex to deliver education, as Dina pointed out. There are around 1 million children living today, for example, in ISIS-controlled areas of Syria. That's not going to be easy to access them, but we need to try. And we need to try using both formal and informal methods, as long as there's a pathway to accreditation and certification. The type of education is equally important. It's not just about access, it's about the quality. I think you heard all of the speakers talk about critical thinking, civic education, tolerance, peace building. We hear that from Iraqi ministers all the time. Please help us with peace building and tolerance education. So clearly education remains a major priority. Third point is on partnership. I think we heard very eloquently from Mr. Karami about the work needed to cross all organizations, to cross the key 3 sectors in NRG, but also the work that's required to cross countries and learn from each other in this sub-regional and regional crisis context, and to continue to invest in that learning over time so that we can share it with all of the surrounding countries. The partnership needs to involve, of course, host governments, donor governments, UN, civil society, and I think we heard a strong pull from private sector today. And I think the links between the sectors became very clear in this partnership. When we think about education, but we also think about the links to employability and ultimately employment. How can we do that unless education colleagues are working with private colleagues to understand markets, for example? The fourth point was on young people. I think a strong rallying call in the NLG that young people need a voice not only in this initiative but in all of the response related to Syria, and we need to be serious rather than just rhetorical about that. It needs to include adolescent girls, and we need to focus not only on, as Dina called it, the instrumentality, but actually some of the softer issues around dignity, identity, purpose that came out strongly from our colleague from World Vision as well. The fifth point is really on advocacy. I think the first phase of NLG has presented a series of very difficult, complex and equally important advocacy issues, a series of grave violations that cross child protection concerns, violence, abduction, the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We need to be more vocal and outspoken, demanding accountability of the parties to the conflict, all parties, to meet their obligations in this regard. The sixth point is on protection, and here I think there's a strong call to learn from the first phase of NLG, where we saw a very prominent child protection program. We're now expanding that into comprehensive frameworks that bridge not only child protection but also social protection. A strong emphasis therefore on cash grants and how we link those cash grants to social sector outcomes, decreasing early marriage through cash grants, increasing out-of-school children, getting them back into school through cash grants. So the linkages across the framework. The seventh point is really one for perhaps our international financial institutions and our donor community. You've been very generous. We couldn't have done any of this work without the support and the very generous support of the donor governments. But unfortunately the conflict continues, and we need to transform the short-term humanitarian support, and we see it already happening, into predictable, longer-term, higher quality financing. Without that, none of this rhetoric around resilience will be meaningful. And the final point is really that ultimately I think what we've heard from everyone today is that the crisis in Syria and surrounding countries is not just about military games between domestic, regional and world powers. It's not just about the geopolitical shifts in the region. It's actually about people. And fundamentally the people who we need to invest in are children and young people. Without that, even as we all hope a serious political resolution will occur quickly, without the investment in young people, we won't have the citizens to rebuild the Syria of the future. I thank you all for your active engagement. It's been a tremendous panel, and join me in thanking the panel, please.